A howling wind ripped across the frozen wastelands of Ceylon 3, a moon far beyond the outer rings of human space travel. Nothing living was supposed to survive out there. Just icy storms, broken machinery from long-forgotten colonies, and the pale blue glow of a sun too distant to offer warmth. But in the middle of this bleak white desert, something small was moving. Barely. Shivering. Hiding under the broken remains of a crashed scout pod. She was just a child. Alien, small and fragile, with violet-tinted skin and bright silver eyes that flickered like stars when they caught the light. Her name was Zuri, though no one was around to speak it anymore. Her tribe had once roamed these lands long ago, scavengers and survivors, avoiding war zones and cold death alike. But this time, the storm came too fast. Too violent. The elders panicked. The strong carried what they could. In the rush, the little one had been left behind. Zuri didn't cry anymore. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was. But the tears froze the moment they touched her cheeks. She had learned not to waste them. She sat curled under a piece of bent metal, trying to remember the sound of her mother's voice. Her fingers, thin and clawed, gripped the edge of her only blanket, a tattered patch of fur her father gave her the day before he vanished into the white. Her breath came out in soft puffs, barely visible in the swirling snow. The cold was crawling into her bones. Her thoughts began to slow. She knew what this meant. This is how the end feels, she thought. Quiet. Alone. But then, a sound. Not the roar of wind. Not the crack of shifting ice. Something else. A pulse. Faint, steady, almost like a heartbeat. No, it was coming from above. Lights. Yellow-white beams piercing through the snow from the sky. They moved with purpose, scanning the ground, slicing through the storm like a blade. Zuri's ears twitched. Her eyes widened. She wanted to run, but her legs refused. She wanted to call out, but her throat burned with frostbite. So she did the only thing she could, watched. The lights grew closer. A strange craft, nothing like her people's technology, hovered overhead. Then it landed, kicking up snow in a wide circle, forcing Zuri to duck beneath her shelter as ice and wind blasted past her. The ship's ramp opened. A figure stepped out. It was tall, covered in thick dark armor, and moved slowly, carefully, like it was aware that something fragile might be nearby. It wasn't alien, not one of her kind. Zuri had never seen one before, not in real life, but she had heard stories. Stories of the two-legged creatures called humans, whose hands could build cities and destroy worlds. Some aliens called them monsters, others called them gods. She didn't know what to believe. But now, one was walking straight toward her. He held a scanner in one hand, a flickering hologram in the other. His face was hidden behind a frost-covered helmet. But the voice that came from his speaker was calm, gentle. Life sign detected. Small, weak, close. Zuri shrank back. The human paused, then knelt down, placing a small square device in the snow. It blinked red once, then hummed. A soft warmth spread out in a circle, melting snow, pushing back the cold. The child felt it almost instantly. Her ears twitched again. Warmth. Real warmth. But still, she didn't move. Not yet. The human removed his helmet. Underneath was a pale face, lined from wind and time, eyes sharp but kind. He looked tired, like someone who had seen too much. He scanned the area again, slower this time. Then, suddenly, his eyes locked onto hers. Just a flicker, a glint of silver behind the metal. His brows lifted. "You're just a kid," he whispered. He didn't move closer. Instead, he sat down right there in the snow, just outside the warmth of the heater, as if waiting for her to choose. Zuri stared. Was this a trick? Was he dangerous? He didn't look like the monsters from the stories. He looked cold, like her. She hesitated, then inched forward, just a little. The man saw and smiled. "That's it," he said softly. "I'm not gonna hurt you. Name's Jackson. I was just doing a scan run, checking for life signs. Didn't think I'd find anyone out here. Zuri didn't understand his words fully, but his tone was something ancient that all creatures knew. Safe, not a threat. She took another step. Easy, that's it. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small bar wrapped in silver. You hungry? Zuri stared at it, then at him. A long pause stretched between them. The storm roared in the distance, but for a moment it felt far away. The only sound was the soft hum of the heater, the quiet puff of Jackson's breath, and the faint crunch of snow as Zuri finally stepped into the light. That was the moment everything changed. Not for Zuri alone, not for Jackson, but for two worlds that had long feared each other. Because in the middle of a frozen Diffland, two beings from different stars chose trust over fear. And though they didn't know it yet, their meeting would echo across the galaxy in ways no one could imagine. But for now, the only thing that mattered was warmth and survival, and that first silent step into hope. Snow swirled in chaotic spirals as the storm roared louder around the two unlikely figures. Jackson stayed seated in the snow, unmoving, making no sudden gestures as the small alien child crept toward him like a frightened animal. Every step she took was hesitant, cautious. Her tiny, clawed feet left light impressions in the slush, quickly being covered again by drifting flakes. She looked ready to flee at any moment, her large silver eyes locked onto the human with silent curiosity and deep, ancient fear. Jackson held out the ration bar a little further, careful not to cross whatever invisible line existed between them. He had seen a lot during his years as a field scout: rogue robots, hostile terrain, even wild alien creatures, but never had he come face to face with a living child like this one. Not on Ceylon 3. Not here, where all life was supposed to be long gone. He studied her closely. Her small frame trembled from cold, skin etched with delicate patterns like frost on glass. Her nose was small, almost like a feline's, and her ears twitched with every gust of wind. A layer of frost clung to her thin hair. It was a miracle she had lasted this long. No protective suit, no heat source, no obvious shelter, just a patch of bent metal and stubborn will. Here, Jackson said gently, placing the bar on a flat rock halfway between them. It's food. You don't have to eat it now. Just take it if you want it. The child didn't respond, but her gaze flicked from his face to the bar, then back again. Jackson let out a slow breath. His fingers were already going numb. The portable heat generator could only do so much, and the temperatures were dropping fast. He tapped the side of his helmet, activating his internal log. Log entry 1247. Location: Outer Sector, Ceylon 3, Glacier Wastes. Life form found: young, not human. Estimated age: 5 to 7 cycles, maybe less. No signs of adult presence. Immediate survival protocol engage. No backup reachable due to storm interference. Will remain on site. His voice, usually sharp and professional in recordings, trembled slightly now. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was something else. He looked back at the child. She hadn't moved. You got a name? He asked. Still no answer. He sighed, brushing frost from his sleeves. All right. No rush. I'll just sit here. Talk to myself. Maybe tell a story. The wind howled again, louder this time, like it was trying to drown them out. I used to tell stories to my daughter, Jackson said, smiling faintly. Back when Earth still had forests. Real forests. Not those metal parks on the orbit stations. She liked trees, birds, all those things you probably never saw. Something in Zuri's eyes changed when he spoke of a daughter. Her ears perked just slightly. A small shift, a silent recognition. Jackson caught it but didn't push. She died, he said softly. War took her, not directly, not like a laser blast, but in pieces, bit by bit. Grief's funny that way. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was respectful, like the child understood the meaning, even if not the words. Jackson leaned back slightly and pulled a small sphere from his utility belt. He pressed a button, and the orb floated up, glowing softly. It emitted a faint hum and cast warm light in all directions. The snow around them began to melt slowly. "Shelter bubble," he said. "Not military grade, but better than nothing." The orb rose higher, and an invisible field began to expand. Snowflakes that entered it instantly evaporated. Wind bent around them. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them a small space of peace. Zuri took another step forward. Jackson didn't react. He didn't want to break whatever courage he had found. She reached the ration bar. Her hands were shaking as she picked it up. She sniffed it, suspicious, then took the tiniest bite. The reaction was immediate. Her body perked up, the warmth of calories rushing into a system long starved. She looked at Jackson, and for the first time, there was something like gratitude in her eyes. "There you go," he murmured, his breath fogging in the warming air. "Told you. Not poison." She blinked once, then crouched down, still keeping a good distance, but no longer hiding. Jackson noticed her eyes never left him, not for a second, even as she ate. He took another deep breath, reaching again into his pack, this time pulling out a folded thermal blanket. He spread it carefully on the snow between them, then pushed it a little closer. "Wrap up if you want. I've got more." Zuri didn't move, but then, with the tiniest effort, she crawled forward and dragged the edge of the blanket toward herself. Her hands moved quickly, wrapping it around her shoulders like she'd done it 100 times before. "You're a survivor," Jackson whispered. "Tougher than most soldiers I know." He leaned back, looking up at the sky. The storm wasn't easing. If anything, it looked worse. Clouds as dark as rust churned above, hiding stars, making navigation impossible. He activated his wrist comm. "Control, this is Scout Jackson reporting an emergency. I have a living alien child. Repeat, a minor. I require evac ASAP." The reply was static. Then a burst of garbled noise. "Control, respond. Storm or not. I need an extraction." More static. Jackson sighed and shut the comm down. "We're stuck," he said aloud, half to the child, half to himself. "Great." Zuri watched him closely. Then she said something. A word, short, strange, melodic. He didn't understand it, but the tone meant something. He pointed to himself. "Jackson." She tilted her head. He tried again. "Jax, on." A pause. Then, very quietly, her voice barely louder than the wind, she answered. "Zuri." Jackson froze for a moment, then smiled. A real, warm smile that hadn't graced his face in years. "Zuri," he repeated softly. "Nice to meet you." They sat in silence, the two of them, wrapped in a fragile bubble of warmth, while the frozen world screamed around them. They had no rescue, no plan, and very little time. But for now, they had names. And that was a start. The night stretched on like an endless breath held by the universe. Time moved slowly on Cylon 3, especially in the dark hours when stars hid behind thick ice clouds, and the storm howled like a living beast. The cold was no longer just outside the small shelter bubble. It pressed in from every direction, testing the limits of Jackson's gear and the courage of a fragile alien child. Inside the protective dome of warmth created by the hovering sphere, Jackson sat cross-legged, facing the small girl. Zuri, wrapped tightly in the thermal blanket he'd given her, was curled up like a sleeping animal. But she wasn't asleep. Her silver eyes were half open, watching him even as her body fought to rest. The fear wasn't gone, just buried beneath the layers of exhaustion and uncertainty. She didn't trust him, not fully. But she hadn't run. That was something. Jackson leaned back against a snow-covered rock and let his breath escape in a slow, tired sigh. The heat bubble was starting to flicker. Not much power left. He'd only brought enough charge for a standard recon sweep. Nothing prepared him for staying overnight in a death zone with a child from another world. He tapped his chest panel, trying the radio again. Scout 3-1 to command. I have a miner with me. Not human. Possible first contact. We need extraction immediately. Repeat. Extraction. Coordinates locked. Static. Then silence. He switched it off, muttering under his breath. Of course, useless tech. Zuri shifted under the blanket, letting out a tiny involuntary sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. Jackson looked over and immediately softened. She was still shivering, despite the blanket, despite the heat. Her species wasn't made for this kind of cold. Not for isolation. Not for being abandoned. He reached for his last heat pod and cracked it open. It hissed as warmth poured from the small device. He placed it gently beside her. Zuri flinched, then slowly edged closer to it, hands creeping out to hover over the invisible warmth. That's better, Jackson murmured. Little things. That's how we survive out here. He watched her for a long while. Her breathing began to slow, becoming steady. A quiet rhythm in the middle of a world that had forgotten how to be kind. He looked up again at the storm, its dark tendrils clawing across the sky, thick with ice and electricity. They weren't going anywhere tonight. He activated the memory log again. Entry 1248. Still stranded. Storms growing stronger. Shelter stable for now. Minor subject, identified as Zuri, is responsive. Vitals appear stable but weak. No adult signs in a 5-kilometer radius. Shelter orb power at 38%. Heating unit down to last cell. Attempted contact with command unsuccessful. He paused, eyes drifting back to the child. Zuri speaks her name. Possibly understands some words. Behavior shows signs of high intelligence and trauma. She trusts me. A little. He clicked off the log. Zuri stirred again. Her eyes met his in the low light. She said something. Short, sharp. The word meant nothing to him, but the tone held worry. She pointed toward the storm outside, then made a motion across her neck. Jackson nodded slowly. Yeah, I get it. Storm bad. Very bad. She repeated the motion, then looked down, hugging the blanket tighter. He realized she wasn't just warning him. She was remembering. Her people had left. Maybe they were taken. Maybe they ran, but she was certain none of them were coming back. Jackson looked around the small bubble of heat. This wasn't going to hold forever. And when the power ran out, so would their chance at survival. He leaned forward. Zuri, he said, softly but firmly. She looked up. I know you don't understand all my words, but listen. We're not gonna make it here much longer. The storm's too strong. This shelter won't hold till morning. I need to find something better. He stood slowly, testing the ground beneath him. The wind outside the bubble slammed against the invisible shield, sending ripples across the barrier. He turned back to her. You stay here. I'll scout just a little ahead. If I find anything, I'll come back and get you. Zuri's eyes widened. She shook her head sharply and grabbed the edge of his coat with one small, trembling hand. It was the first time she touched him. He stopped. You want to come? She nodded once. Jackson crouched beside her, watching the fear in her face. But behind that fear was something else. Determination. You're tough, he whispered. All right then. He pulled out his spare jacket, not sized for someone her small, but it would have to do. She climbed into it with effort, swinging in the heavy fabric. Her tiny arms barely fit through the sleeves. He zipped it up as far as he could, then double-wrapped the thermal blanket around her again. Outside the bubble, the storm growled like a living monster. He checked the orb's charge. 19%. Not enough to last the night. Jackson took a breath, then hit the recall switch. The orb shrank its field and floated back into his hand. Cold rushed in instantly, biting and brutal. Zuri gasped, but didn't run. She clutched his leg tightly as he activated his pathlight. A narrow beam cut through the storm, barely, casting long shadows on the jagged ice. He looked down at her. "Stick close. Don't let go." They moved together into the storm. The cold was worse now. Alive, cruel. Snow blasted their faces, stung their eyes, filled every crack in their clothes. But they pushed forward, one slow step at a time. Jackson's scanner beeped faintly every few seconds, trying to map out the terrain through the interference. The night felt endless. The world was white noise, a blur of snow and pain. But every time Jackson felt himself falter, he looked down and saw Zuri, holding on, taking each step beside him. She didn't cry, didn't whine, just walked, her small hand wrapped tight around his coat. They didn't speak. The wind wouldn't let them. But they walked. And somewhere in the dark, the ice began to change. Ahead, rising through the snow like a forgotten monument, stood the twisted skeleton of an old tower. Rusted steel and cracked glass stretched upward, half buried in frost. One of the old relay beacons. Dead, probably. But shelter, solid walls, a roof, maybe more. Jackson's voice was nearly stolen by the wind. "There, that's it. We just need." His legs gave out. He collapsed into the snow, hard, dragging Zuri with him. The cold had finally sunk too deep. His body shivered violently. Fingers numb, breathing uneven. His vision began to blur. He tried to stand, but couldn't. Zuri stood beside him, tiny fists clenched. He looked up at her. Go inside. It's safe, warm." She didn't move. He tried to reach for her, but his arms refused. The last thing he saw before darkness swept over him was Zuri dropping the blanket, standing tall despite the storm, her silver eyes blazing with defiance against the cold. Then everything faded to black. The wind howled like a furious spirit as it rushed across the open plain, battering the ice-covered tower with invisible fists. Shards of snow and frost danced through the air like razors. The old relay beacon stood silent, long abandoned, its outer panels rattling in the gale. It had once been a proud communication hub, part of a forgotten human colony. But now it was only a rusted skeleton, half buried in ice and memory. And at the foot of that forgotten tower, a small alien child stood in the snow, staring down at the collapsed figure of a man who had tried to save her. Zuri's thin body shook violently in the cold. Her large silver eyes were locked on Jackson's still form. His limbs were rigid. His breaths were shallow and fading fast. He had tried to keep walking for her, pushing beyond the limits of his strength, and now he lay motionless in the frost. His face had gone pale beneath the frostbite creeping across his skin, and even the glowing orb in his hand had dimmed, flickering uncertainly like a dying star. For a long moment, Zuri didn't move. The fear inside her wanted to run, to hide, to curl up and wait for the end. But something stronger held her in place, something she had never known before. Not exactly. The human had stayed. He had not left her like the others. He had wrapped her in warmth, given her food, spoken gently. And now he was dying. Her tiny hands curled into fists. She didn't have words in his language, not enough to speak, but she knew what she had to do. Zuri dropped the thermal blanket around her shoulders and knelt beside Jackson. She pressed her fingers against his neck, like she'd seen the old healers do in her village, before everything fell apart. There was a pulse, weak, slowing, but still there. He was not gone yet. The door to the tower loomed nearby, a heavy metal hatch, half buried in snow, its control panel blinking red with power warnings. Zuri rose and approached it, stumbling forward as wind beat against her body. She reached the panel and slammed her palm against it. Nothing happened. The blinking continued. A red error symbol appeared, written in human language he couldn't read. She tried again. No response. Zuri backed away, frustrated, eyes searching the tower's base. She remembered something, an old ritual from her people. When technology failed, they used sound, rhythm, vibration. The machines had once been alive in a way, and sound spoke to them. The elders had taught her the pattern to awaken the slumbering metal. She knelt in the snow, pulled a smooth stone from a small pouch tied at her waist, and began to strike it rhythmically against the side of the tower. Not hard, not loud, just steady. Tunk, tunk tunk, tunk, tunk tunk. It was a pattern passed down for generations, a language older than the machines. At first, there was nothing. Then a soft click echoed from the door. A light turned yellow, then green. Zuri's eyes widened. She rushed forward and pressed her hand against the panel again. The door hissed, groaned, then slowly opened inward with a grinding screech, releasing a gust of warmer air from inside. The old backup systems were still running, just barely, a miracle hiding in metal and ice. Zuri sprinted back to Jackson and grabbed his arm. He was heavy, far heavier than she was, but she didn't stop. She pulled with all her strength, inch by inch, dragging him across the snow. Her fingers burned from the cold, her feet numb and raw, but she kept pulling. The wind screamed louder, as if trying to stop her. She refused. By the time they crossed the threshold into the tower, she had no strength left. She collapsed beside him on the floor, breathing hard, chest rising and falling rapidly. The door shut behind them, locking the cold out. Inside, the air was dry, stale, but mercifully warmer. Old lights flickered to life along the walls, casting a pale glow over the room. Dust floated lazily in the air, untouched for years. Zuri sat up slowly and looked around. The space inside was small, a control room with scattered consoles, broken chairs, and blinking displays. A rusted heater in the corner hummed faintly. Not much, but enough. She stood and stumbled toward the heater. With effort, she found the control switch and pressed it. The unit coughed, sputtered, then began to glow a deep orange. Warm air rolled out, weak but real. She returned to Jackson and began removing his gloves, his helmet, opening his jacket carefully. His skin was ice cold. She remembered the warmth stones from her home, how her mother used to heat them for her when she was sick. She had no stones here, but there was heat in the room. She pulled Jackson closer to the heater, inch by inch, laying his hands near the warm vent. Then she wrapped the thermal blanket tightly around him. Zuri sat beside him, placing both of her hands on his chest. She whispered in her own language, quiet words meant for strength and protection. Her people had once believed in sky spirits, in ancient protectors that watched from above. Zuri had never truly believed in those stories, but now she prayed to them anyway. Time passed, minutes, maybe longer. Jackson stirred. His fingers twitched. His eyes opened slowly, barely. He saw her face, blurry through half-frozen vision, silver eyes shining in the dim light. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. "Zuri," he whispered, hoarse. She didn't reply. She simply reached forward and gently placed her small hand on his forehead. You saved me?" he asked, confused. She nodded. Jackson blinked slowly, trying to understand. "I passed out in the snow. I thought." He looked around. The walls, the heater, the hum of power. "How did you?" Zuri looked at him and, without a word, pointed toward the old control panel, then toward her stone, then back to him. Jackson let out a weak chuckle. "You figured it out. You opened the tower." She nodded again, eyes glowing with quiet pride. He closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him. "You little genius." Zuri didn't understand the words, but the warmth in his voice told her enough. Together, they lay there beside the heater, wrapped in shared silence and faint hope. The storm still raged outside, but inside the tower, two beings from different worlds had fought back against death, not with weapons, Not with technology, but with trust, instinct, and a spark of something greater. The kind of courage only found when everything else is stripped away. And in that forgotten tower, lit by flickering lights and the slow rhythm of returning breath, a bond deeper than species or language began to grow. One that would change everything. The storm outside hadn't let up. It screamed across the icy plains of Ceylon 3 with the fury of a living creature, shaking the old relay tower's outer walls until rivets groaned and metal creaked. But inside, the world was still, quiet, and warm, at least for the moment. Pale orange light from the heater glowed against the frost-covered walls, and soft flickers from the old backup systems blinked in and out like tired stars. Jackson lay curled under the thermal blanket, his breathing slow but steady. His color was returning, the frostbite on his cheeks fading as warmth sank into his skin. His body had come back from the edge of collapse, but his strength was still fragile, like a fire just beginning to flicker again after being nearly smothered by snow. Zuri sat beside him, her small figure cross-legged on the cold floor. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were fixed on the door, and her ears twitched every time a loud bang echoed from outside. The wind was violent, relentless. The metal tower rattled from time to time, making her flinch. But she didn't run. She didn't hide. She stayed. The heater's hum lulled the space into a rhythm. Something soft, something safe. It was the first moment of true calm she had known in days, maybe longer. Even her stomach, which had felt like a pit of emptiness for so long, was quiet now. She had eaten. She was warm. And the human who had saved her was breathing again. Still, something in her heart felt uneasy. Jackson stirred beneath the blanket, shifting slightly. Zuri leaned closer, watching as his eyes opened. Slowly, but with more clarity than before. His gaze found her immediately. "You're still here," he said, voice rasping but clearer than it had been. Zuri tilted her head. He managed a faint smile. "I thought I might wake up alone again." She said nothing, but something in her expression made him feel less alone. He sat up carefully, every muscle aching. "What happened?" he asked. Zuri pointed to the door, then to the stone she still carried, tucked safely in the fold of the blanket. "You got us inside," he said, slowly understanding. "You dragged me in." She nodded once, firm. Jackson let out a soft laugh, surprised by his own emotion. "You saved me. I guess we're even now." Zuri blinked, as if unsure what that meant. He didn't explain further. Instead, he looked around, eyes taking in the old tower's state. Dusty, rusted, but functional. "This place should have collapsed a long time ago," he muttered. "But somehow it's still here." He shifted to his knees and dragged himself toward one of the old control consoles. Zuri followed him, watching with wide eyes as he brushed off frost and flipped a few switches. The screens flickered. Most were dead, but one sputtered to life, showing static and then a jagged display of the surrounding region. "No communications," Jackson muttered, but the map still running. The screen showed a digital map of the surrounding terrain, blurred by interference but readable. He tapped a flashing symbol on the edge of the display. "There," he said, "emergency beacon. If we can get that system running, we might have a shot." Zuri stepped closer, looking at the screen. Her eyes traced the lines and symbols like it was a language she almost understood. She pointed to a blinking red triangle near the bottom of the map. Jackson looked at it. "That's us," he said. She nodded. "You're learning fast," he said, impressed. She didn't answer, but her gaze was sharp, alert. Her mind was working. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling thud shook the entire tower. Zuri jumped, startled, eyes darting toward the door. Jackson's muscles tensed. That wasn't the wind. Another thud, louder this time. Closer. He grabbed his pack and pulled out a compact scanner. The device beeped rapidly as it detected movement just outside the tower. "Life form," he said. "Big." Zuri's hand moved to the stone again. Her body stiffened, not with fear, but with readiness. Jackson lowered his voice. "We might have company." Another crash. The wall groaned. Zuri stepped in front of him. "Hey," Jackson said, reaching out. "Careful." But she didn't move. Her tiny figure stood between him and the door as the metal shook once more, and then, with a deafening roar, the outer hatch bent inward. Jackson cursed under his breath and grabbed his sidearm. He wasn't sure it would do much against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. The scanner beeped again. Multiple signatures. The hatch gave one final groan, and then burst open. A blinding gust of snow flew in. Shapes moved in the storm beyond. Large, fast, and clawed. Not machines. Not human. Wild predators of the ice, drawn by the heat, the sound, and the scent of life. Jackson raised his weapon. "Stay behind me." But Zuri didn't. She stepped forward, pulling the glowing stone from her blanket. It pulsed with light, blue and gold flickers dancing across its surface. The creatures stepped into view. 3 of them. Wolf-like but bigger, with skeletal faces and glowing blue eyes. Their breath steamed in the cold, and their claws scraped across the metal floor. Jackson prepared to fire. Zuri raised the stone high. The lead creature growled, but paused. Its eyes locked on the stone. Zuri whispered something, short, powerful. Her voice echoed unnaturally through the room. The creatures shifted, hesitated. Then one lunged. Jackson fired once. The blast lit up the tower, striking the creature's side. It howled but didn't fall. The others snarled. Zuri didn't back away. Instead, she took one sharp step forward and slammed the stone to the ground. A shockwave burst outward, silent, invisible, but powerful. The creatures shrieked in pain, backing away, shaking their heads as if something pierced their minds. The light from the stone flared, then faded. The creatures didn't wait. They turned and ran, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they had appeared. Jackson lowered his weapon slowly, stunned. "What did you just do?" Zuri turned around, face calm, though her hands were shaking. She tucked the stone away again and looked up at him. The answer was simple. She had protected him, just as he had protected her. Jackson shook his head in disbelief. "You're full of surprises." The door slammed shut again, this time locking with a hiss of frozen air. The tower was silent once more. Jackson looked down at Zuri, the tiny warrior who had just stood against monsters with nothing but a glowing rock and ancient words. She was more than a child. She was something else, something powerful, rare, and still unknown. And now, he realized, he wasn't just trying to survive for himself anymore. He had a mission. Protect her, no matter what came next. The wind outside finally quieted. After what felt like days of constant roaring, the ice storm had retreated into silence. No more thunderous gusts slamming into the tower walls. No more howls echoing across the frozen plains of Ceylon 3. Just an eerie, absolute stillness. Inside the rusted communication tower, the temperature had finally climbed to a level where breath no longer steamed in the air. The old heaters still hummed faintly, their light orange glow painting warm shadows across the floor. Jackson sat on the ground, back pressed against the wall, watching as Zuri inspected the panels near the entrance with childlike focus and quiet determination. He couldn't stop staring at her. What he'd witnessed the night before still looped in his mind like a memory that didn't belong to him. The alien creatures, larger than wolves, had stormed in, snarling, glowing, deadly. Jackson had been sure that was the end. But then Zuri, small and shaking but utterly unafraid, had stepped between him and death. She had slammed her stone to the ground and spoken words older than anything he knew. And they had listened. No, they had obeyed. Jackson rubbed the side of his head. still trying to make sense of it. He looked down at his handheld scanner again. The readings were better now that the storm had passed. The interference had dropped significantly, and the atmospheric pressure was finally stable enough to allow long-range signals. He tapped the screen, activating the tower's communication array. The old beacon lights sparked to life, barely, and the terminal crackled as if surprised to be used again. "Let's see what you've got left in you," Jackson muttered. Zuri turned and walked over quietly, her large silver eyes scanning the screen. Jackson noticed her and smiled. "You're getting good at this. You want to try?" She blinked, not understanding the words but sensing the offer. He slid over, allowing her to press her small hand on the cracked surface of the panel. "Here," he said, gently guiding her fingers. "This button sends the signal." Zuri's hand hovered over it, unsure, but then pressed it with confidence. A loud ping filled the room, followed by a low electronic hum. On the console screen, the emergency beacon flickered red, then green. A signal had been sent. Jackson let out a slow breath. "Good job, kid. With any luck, someone out there heard us." He didn't say what they were both thinking. That no one might answer. Zuri sat cross-legged beside him, her small form wrapped again in the thermal blanket. She looked calm, but Jackson had learned by now that beneath her stillness was a mind that never stopped watching, thinking, surviving. He studied the stone she kept tucked at her side, smooth, glowing faintly now that the immediate danger had passed. It wasn't just a rock. It reacted to her emotions, her presence. It had driven away the beasts with a wave of force that shouldn't be possible. Jackson had seen a lot of tech in his time, human and alien alike, but this was something different. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. Zuri looked at him. "The stone. The power thing." He gestured toward it. Zuri stared at it, then looked down. She held it in her hands and ran her fingers along its surface. Her lips moved slightly, whispering something in her language. A prayer, a memory. Then she pointed upward. "To the sky?" Jackson asked. She nodded, then pointed to her heart. Jackson felt a chill, one not caused by the cold. "From the stars, but also from you." Zuri held the stone tight to her chest, nodding once again. Jackson leaned back. "So it's connected to you. Somehow." A long silence settled between them. He knew what was coming. If someone received the beacon signal, they'd be here soon. A rescue party, a science team, maybe even a military squad. And when they arrived, they wouldn't just see a scared little girl in the snow. They'd see an anomaly, a threat, something valuable. They would want the stone, and they'd want her. Jackson stared at her for a moment, then stood slowly and walked to one of the tower's cracked windows. He stared out across the frozen plains. The storm had stripped the ice clean, leaving jagged formations glinting like broken glass. Beyond that, nothing but white emptiness. No movement, no ships. Not yet. He tapped his communicator again. Scout Jackson reporting in. "Emergency signal broadcast from Relay Beacon 9B, situation critical but stable. One non-human miner in protective custody. Requesting extraction protocol, Alpha 9. Repeat, Alpha 9. He let go of the device and turned back to Zuri. She was watching him, her eyes unreadable. He crouched beside her. They might come now. She tilted her head. "More humans," he said. "Big ship, big noise. Maybe soldiers." She didn't react with fear like he expected. She just listened. "I'll protect you," he said firmly. "No matter what they say. I promise." Zuri blinked, slowly, and reached out. She placed her tiny hand on his arm. Jackson didn't need a translator for that. Suddenly, the tower lights flickered. The console beeped. Incoming signal. Jackson jumped up, racing to the terminal. He pressed a series of buttons and pulled up the transmission. A cold, clipped voice came through. "This is Command Vessel Orion. Emergency signal received. Landing party en route." ETA, 20 minutes. Prepare for extraction. Report details of unknown entity. Jackson stared at the screen, jaw tight. Unknown entity. He tapped the mic. Copy that. Orion. Subject is a juvenile, non-aggressive, isolated survivor. Repeat, non-aggressive. She's just a kid. Keep the team light. No heavy weapons. Silence for a moment. Then, orders noted. Stand by. The transmission ended. Jackson turned slowly. Zuri was standing now, holding the stone. Her expression hadn't changed, but her body was tense. They're coming, he said. I'll keep you safe. You hear me? She nodded. Jackson didn't know how much she understood, but he knew she trusted him now. And that trust meant everything. Outside, the low hum of engines began to fill the silence. A ship. Close. Jackson stepped forward and stood beside her. Whatever happens, we stay together. Got it. Zuri didn't answer with words. She just reached out and took his hand and held it tightly. A low rumble trembled through the walls of the tower as the first shadows of the ship crept across the icy landscape outside. Snow, stirred by the descending engines, whipped into small spirals across the ground. The once still world began to stir again, not with the chaos of a storm this time, but with the cold precision of organized arrival. Inside the tower, Jackson stood at the window, shoulders tense, watching as the sleek black form of the Orion's shuttle began its descent. It hovered with practiced control, landing gear unfolding like claws into the snow. The glow from its underbelly lit the frozen terrain in sharp, sterile light. No beauty, just cold design. Zuri stood behind him, silent, gripping the smooth stone close to her chest. Its glow pulsed faintly, slow and calm. For now, her eyes, wide and alert, were fixed not on the ship, but on Jackson's back. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But every part of her body told the same story. She didn't want to be taken. Not again. Jackson knew it. He'd seen that same expression on human refugees during the border wars. He'd seen it on children who had lost everything and still had more to lose. He turned and knelt beside her. Zuri, he said softly, they're going to come in. They'll be curious, maybe even a little scared. She didn't respond. I'll talk. You stay with me. Don't do anything unless I say. Don't show them the stone. Her eyes flicked down to the glowing relic. She clutched it tighter and gave the faintest nod. Jackson reached out, brushing her shoulder gently. You saved me. Now I'm going to save you. The shuttle's side hatch hissed open, and a ramp extended onto the ice. Several figures emerged, dressed in matte black exosuits, 3 soldiers, 2 scientists, and 1 commander. The helmets were reflective, their visors hiding their faces. Each step they took was methodical, silent but heavy with purpose. Jackson opened the tower door and stepped out, the biting cold returning to his lungs like a warning. He raised one hand in greeting. Scout Jackson, reporting. Subject inside. Do not approach with weapons. The lead figure, Commander Harrow, stopped a few paces away. He removed his helmet, revealing a face carved from experience and suspicion. You're a hard man to reach, Jackson. Jackson gave a weak smile. Storms tend to make things difficult. Harrow looked past him toward the tower entrance. The subject, still inside. She's a child. Her name is Zuri. Harrow's eyes narrowed. You've named her. She told me her name. A pause. That's unexpected. She's intelligent, responsive. She's not a threat. Another pause. She carries a glowing artifact, Jackson added carefully. Unknown tech. Possibly ancient. It responded to her emotions. She used it to drive away predators. Now Harrow looked intrigued. Where is it? She's holding it. It's bonded to her. Is it a weapon? No, Jackson said firmly. Or if it is, it only reacts when she's afraid. Harrow exchanged a look with one of the scientists. Then he gestured. We'll assess. Stand aside. Jackson didn't move. She stays with me. This isn't a negotiation, Scout. It is now. Tension grew in the space between them. The soldiers behind Harrow didn't raise their weapons, but their fingers hovered a little closer to the triggers. Harrow studied Jackson for a long moment. You're tired. Cold. Probably not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearer than I have in years, Jackson replied. At that, Harrow nodded to one of the scientists, who stepped forward and entered the tower. Inside, Zuri stood motionless in the center of the room. The scientist paused at the threshold, surprised to see a child no taller than his waist, holding something that shimmered like a star pressed into crystal. The air around her felt charged, not dangerous, just aware. The man raised a scanner. The device immediately blinked red. Unclassifiable. Zuri didn't move. She stared at the man with the sharp calmness of someone who had seen loss before and was ready to see it again. But when Jackson stepped in behind the scientist, she relaxed slightly. It's all right, he said to her. Just let them look. The scan failed again. The stone rejected the signal. The scientist stepped back, muttering into his recorder. Artifact appears to repel artificial scanning. Subject remains emotionally connected. Energy readings are unstable but controlled. Further analysis required in lab conditions. Jackson's eyes hardened. She doesn't go anywhere without me. That's not your decision, Harrow replied from the doorway. She's not a specimen. She's a person. Do you even hear yourself? Harrow said. This is history. The first natural alien survivor from this region. She's carrying a living power source, maybe something left behind by a long-dead civilization. This is bigger than you. Jackson stepped forward. And that's exactly why you need someone who sees her as more than data. The commander said nothing. Outside, another sound rose in the distance, a deep, rhythmic thrum. Another ship. Zuri turned sharply. She seemed to recognize it. Her grip on the stone tightened. Jackson heard it too. That's not Orion. What is that? Harrow tapped his comm. Unscheduled contact. Possible independent scavenger. Or worse. The tension snapped instantly. Get the child secured, Harrow barked. Two soldiers moved toward Zuri. Jackson stepped between them. No. She's in danger. She'll be in more if you grab her like that. Zuri began to breathe faster. The stone in her hands flared with light. The soldiers froze. Everyone back off. Jackson shouted. She's scared. Harrow hesitated. Stand down, he ordered the team, realizing the stone could become unstable again. Zuri stepped back, eyes locked on Jackson. He turned to her. It's okay. I won't let anyone take you. The second ship landed with a deafening boom. Its sides were unmarked, matte gray. No insignias, no ID. The door opened, and figures emerged in scavenger suits. Mercs. Not military. Not scientists. Raiders. Weapons drawn. Cover positions, Harrow shouted. Gunfire erupted, slicing through the cold. Zuri shrieked, dropping to her knees. The stone exploded with light. A dome of golden blue energy erupted outward from her body, rippling across the battlefield like a living shockwave. All weapons within range deactivated. Lights flickered. Machines died. The mercs staggered, confused. Jackson grabbed Zuri and shielded her. It's all right. I've got you. The glow dimmed slowly. Zuri's breathing slowed. The mercs, now stunned and unarmed, retreated into the snow, dragging their fallen with them. The second ship lifted off moments later. Silence returned. Jackson turned to Harrow. Now you see. Harrow, breathless, nodded slowly. She's not a weapon. She's something more. The scientist whispered, she might be a bridge. Jackson stood, still holding Zuri's hand. We treat her like a child. Not a tool. Not a lab sample. Harrow sighed. You'll stay with her. You'll both come with us. But everything changes now. Jackson looked down at Zuri. We're going home. She didn't understand the word, but she smiled. And in that moment, the frostbitten moon of Ceylon 3, once dead and forgotten, had given birth to something new, hope. Not just for one species, but for all.